Hello and welcome again to another in the series of Mapping the Pandemic. This time we look at the impact of the pandemic on policing in the UK. Now, as some of you may remember, the Home Secretary was lampooned when she suggested in the media that the crime rate in the UK has gone down as a result of the lockdown. Some critics suggested that that was just a statement of the obvious. However, what we will try to do over the next hour is to examine the possibilities that while some of the common crime associated with normal business activity may indeed have gone down over the period of the pandemic, other criminal charges increase, and the challenge for the police forces in terms of policing the UK at these very unusual times have been varied and very different from what we experienced before. I'm joined from London, from the UK, from the Institute, by Richard Walton, who is a distinguished fellow of the Institute, a former head of counter-terrorism command, the so-called SO15 at the Metropolitan Police, and by my colleague Keith Ditcham, senior research fellow at the Institute, who leads our Organised Crime and Policing. We'll hear from both of them first, but I would try to remind you that this is meant to be a session, an interactive one, in which you should be able to ask questions. So do use the questions and answers, the Q&A facility on the Zoom app, and keep the questions coming in. I shall try to accommodate as many as I possibly can. First, however, let us turn to Richard Walton.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and a very good afternoon to everybody on this webinar this afternoon. You're very welcome, and particular welcome to those of our overseas guests. I want to talk about policing the pandemic. I co-wrote a paper about 8 weeks ago on this subject before the lockdown in the UK actually took place. And it's quite interesting now to reflect back on what I wrote all those 8 weeks ago with the passage of time. And I'm going to really cover three main areas I want to reflect back on. One is the emergency response by the UK police, and very much the national coordination of that response. Secondly, to look at demand and the impact on crime levels, some crime specifics. Also a little mention of protest and extremism and terrorism. And then finally, I'm going to talk about police enforcement, how the new health coronavirus regulations have been enforced in the UK, and look a little bit about international comparisons as well. So starting off with the first topic, the emergency response within the UK, I think probably it's best to sum that up as saying that the police service here have basically not created a drama out of a crisis. I think they've recognized from the outset that this is a health crisis with a police support role. And obviously, and that's quite unusual because of the previous major incidents that police have been dealing with over the last 20 years have mostly centered around terrorism, when many of the interagency collaborations and fusions of intelligence, if you like, have been honed and worked through. So a lot of the learning from the last 20 years has actually been used in this crisis. If we think firstly about Peel's principles of policing, protecting life, preserving the Queen's peace, and preventing and detecting crime, I think that's been basically delivered in quite a professional way all the way through. We've seen a nationally led emergency response by the National Police Chiefs Council, led by Martin Hewitt, supported very well by the College of Policing, who put together some very good practical advice for police officers around the UK, which has been, if you like, the measures that have been put in place. Essentially, the police have got one seat at the Cobra table, so I think they've understood their place. Their role has been to support the health service, the emergency service, in the lead in this crisis. I think they anticipated, certainly as we all did, that there would be a tremendous impact on the capacity of the police in the UK. with sickness levels rising quite severely. This happened in the very first few weeks, I think, but only up to a level of about 16 to 20%, comparable to police forces around the world, but not the worst case scenario of a 50% reduction in the workforce. The National Police Mobilization Plan, which is coordinated from the National Police Operations Centre, NPOC, if you like, the centre, the national response, has worked very well. There hasn't been a need to move police resources around the country in any particular way, such as we've seen for terrorist incidents. Most police forces have been able to handle this locally with their local resilience forums in a very professional way. So what has been the impact, though, on demand and on crime? Well, demand has certainly dropped, substantially. I don't think any of us understood that demand would drop quite so markedly. None of us quite understood what lockdown constituted. And obviously, having experienced that, we now know why crime has also been impacted. So if you look at crime levels, somewhere between 28% to 35% reduction in total notifiable offences. That's all crimes across the board, with some very marked reductions in crime as you'd expect. So huge reductions in robbery. I think in London, 67% drop in London. Violent crime down by 27%, and murder down, and antisocial behaviour obviously up. But in terms of what's happened in terms of increases of crime, we've seen an increase in domestic violence, although perhaps not as marked as we might have anticipated. This was forecast. It's fairly obvious that if you confine people to a home or to a place, those who exercise domestic abuse will probably carry out abuse more frequently, and the pressures and the stresses on families will result in more domestic violence. But I think there's been an increase, certainly according to the Home Secretary, of calls to the National Domestic Violence Helpline, but not necessarily a substantial increase to police officers attending. The Lead for Domestic Violence in the UK has talked about a 9% increase in domestic violence incidents and about a quarter increase in domestic violence charges or cautions. We haven't seen the figures yet for hate crime, but they're likely to show an increase, a small increase, based on the, if you like, some of the narrative of hate against Asian communities. So we'll wait and see on that one. Now, across the world, though, we've seen comparable reductions. Interesting statistics, really. If you look at South Africa as an example, this time last year, they'd had 326 murders. They're currently down to 94. In Missouri, one state in the US, 194 murders this time last year, down to 47. So across the world, we're seeing reductions, substantial reductions in crime as countries are in lockdown. Just now to a note to extremism. Obviously, extremism and terrorism hasn't been paused. There have been terrorist attacks around the world, some rather nasty ones in Kabul, in Iraq, and in the Sahel. So terrorism has gone on, but we haven't seen is much reporting of it because there hasn't been much appetite for reporting of terrorism during this crisis. I think probably people have a different perception of terrorism at the moment, and it'd be interesting to see. Obviously, the fear of terrorism might well have diminished after the impact of this particular crisis on populations around the world. It'd be very interesting to see how terrorist groups respond. But some terrorist groups, Boko Haram, etc., and Islamic State, have been pretty active over the period, but it just hasn't been reported on much. So now let's just cover off basically the response by the police in terms of the enforcement measures of that we've been seeing in terms of the reasonable excuse that people have had to justify being out and about. Here, I think we should pause and celebrate basically the British policing model, and the model of policing by consent, and a tremendously modest, common sense approach being adopted by forces across the country. I mean, yes, there have been some isolated cases that have been reported of forces being a little overzealous. I mean, there was a British Transport Police at one stage, I think, prosecuted a woman falsely. We had incidents of some juveniles, young children, being given fixed penalty notices and fines. And we've had the use of drones in Derbyshire, which was a little bit extreme. But putting aside those very small number of cases, I mean, overall, the number of fines have been very, very minimal. If you look at the numbers, it's something less than 9,000 fines have been handed out across the country. I think that's 0.02% of the population have had a fine. If you make some basic comparisons with our neighbours, with similar populations, it makes some stark readings. If you take France, over a similar period that I've referred to, 915,000 fines issued, 15.5 million stops and accounts of the population asking for their identification and their justification going out. Spain, likewise, 869,000 fines between the 14th of March and the 7th of May. Extraordinary measures and a completely different style of policing to the one that's been adopted here. The model here by the College of Policing was set out to officers to engage first, then to explain, encourage, and then enforce. You know, a hugely modest response that I think has been welcomed by the public, helped with social cohesion, and obviously has reduced protests. There's been no real meaningful protest anywhere in the country during this period. So that's my basic introduction. I just wanted to say that looking ahead now, having looked back, what can we expect? Well, the important thing now is that the police service maintains the momentum of this reduction in crime, seizes the initiative to get on the front foot. I mean, there's been a huge explosion of violence across the country in the last 2 years. The figures have been extraordinary. But now with this pause, with this big reduction in crime, there's an opportunity for police to seize the initiative, to take the ground, to take the, if you like, reclaim the streets and those hotspot areas that were previously perhaps the domain of the criminals. I'll let Keith talk about fraud, but obviously we've seen a huge increase in fraud and online fraud and public sector fraud, of course, relating to fake goods and fake PPE. And Keith can talk more about that in a minute. But the important thing now, I think, is that also that the police service learn the lessons of the advances in technology, the use of technology that we've all benefited from, including this webinar now. We can, you know, the police service can now have got an opportunity to move towards more agile working, more flexible working, reducing transport costs, reducing costs of real estate, etc., and obviously improving mental health of officers and staff in forces across the country. So there are some big opportunities. Cressida Dick, the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, yesterday talked about the silver lining of this crisis as far as she was concerned. The Met has, during the lockdown, is visiting 1,000 violent offenders at least twice to try and get them back on the straight and narrow, and have made a number of arrests and seizures of weapons and guns. I think 106 guns, 444 knives, etc. was mentioned yesterday. So the Met clearly getting on the front foot, and I think it's important that all forces do the same thing. This is a marvellous opportunity to sustain a reduction in criminality that we've seen. So that's my basic introduction. I'll hand back to Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Richard. Let's go without further ado to my colleague Keith Ditcham for his introductory remarks, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Please keep the questions coming. I've registered already about 15 all told, all very interesting, and I hope to get to all of them. Keith?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Richard, for your excellent presentation. So what I want to talk today about in the scope of my presentation is how COVID-19 has affected organised crime. In my commentary that I wrote on the 24th of March, the day after the lockdown, it was very early days, and there was a fair degree of supposition and a fair degree of informed guessing, shall we say, as to how organised crime might react to the imposed restrictions. Criminals like the rest of us would not have witnessed such draconian measures before in their lives, let alone in their criminal careers. And thankfully, as Richard has articulated, some of the more extreme measures that were required to help the police and wider law enforcement community have not been needed. So the focus of my presentation, therefore, is on what has changed for organised crime since March, and what are the likely longer-term consequences. Just as we hear talk that life in the UK will never be the same for us in all our work and social life, so too the landscape of organised crime may well look different in the future. So I'd like to begin with a look at why the threat from organised crime is important. And that is because organised crime is a perversion of the moral order, where for the most part, perhaps with the exception of certain sexual offences, the motivation is the overriding concern with profit maximisation and market control. So serious organised crime has previously been described by former Home Secretary Sajid Javid as the deadliest national security threat faced by the UK, and it persistently erodes our economy and communities. It affects more UK citizens more often than any other national security threat. And it impacts on citizens, public services, businesses, institutions, national reputation and infrastructure. That being the case, therefore, a mere pandemic isn't going to frighten organised crime away. What seems clear is that whilst the pandemic has reduced some organised criminal activities, it has simultaneously provided opportunities for new ones. And these changes in the organised criminal economy could have longer term consequences. And that's because organised crime is a business, and like any good business, it's quick to adapt to new changes in the market, in this case criminal markets, from opportunities and threats. In my time in the police and the National Crime Agency, a large time of it spent working abroad, it both amazed and frustrated me how quickly organised crime adapted to threats, often faster than law enforcement. And that's because criminals are not hidebound by rules and regulations that law-abiding citizens observe, and nor the same regulations and rules that the police have to use in relation to the exercise of their powers. So too, boundary and legal jurisdiction considerations are swept aside, whilst law enforcement has to observe two sets of rules: domestic and international legislation that governs what they can and can't do, and for the most part, permissions need to be in place before they can act. So scanning the organised crime landscape, it's evident that some organised criminal activities have been constrained by social distancing measures and travel restrictions. They will take time to reconstitute themselves. So what particular changes has the pandemic brought about? Europol highlighted in their recent report on pandemic profiteering 6 key areas. There's now a high demand for certain goods, such as personal protection equipment and pharmaceuticals. There's a reduced mobility and flow of people across the EU. Working from home has become the new norm and rely on teleworking and digital solutions. And some activities being disrupted to the home environment. Increased anxiety and fear has led to increased vulnerable populations, and the reduced supply of certain illicit goods as well as licit goods has led to a number of fakes. So these conditions have created an opportunity for organised crime to exploit, and so as not to disappoint, organised crime has risen to that challenge. I'll highlight a number of these key areas. And firstly, I want to talk about reduced supply of certain illicit goods with reference to 2 threat areas: drugs and people. Now, I don't want to suggest that people are commodities in their own right, but sadly, human beings are seen as just that by those that seek to exploit their vulnerability. So I wish to highlight too how organised crime has infiltrated the private space through online fraud and cyber-related attacks. So the first question I ask myself is, in the drugs market, is business as usual? Well, not exactly. In Latin America, crime syndicates face an existential threat owing to the massive disruption to their international supply chains. Not only have sales of illegal drugs fallen in the United States, the main market for Mexican cartels, but some of the precursor chemicals they rely on have also stopped arriving from China. At the same time, with the US-Mexico border closed, close to everything but non-essential travel, drug smuggling has become more difficult. It's led to turf wars and a spike in the number of violent incidents between rival groups as they fight over the scarce criminal opportunities that are available. March saw the highest monthly total of organised crime-linked homicides in Mexico in 13 years. Reports from Europe suggest that under lockdown and social distancing policies, street-level prices and consumption of heroin across East and Southern Africa, for example, has shown that heroin prices have increased while purity decreased. It's become more difficult to smuggle drugs into the region. In the cocaine trade, the evidence points to the fact that smuggling appears to be continuing, but with one significant change. And that change is that despite the disruption to their business, Latin American criminals have reverted to sending larger volumes of illicit drugs in one load. To evidence this, Colombian security forces have been involved in operations this year that so far have seized 112 tons of cocaine. And at the end of March, the Colombian Navy intercepted a narco submarine off the Colombia's Pacific coast, carrying a ton of cocaine. This is the 12th time that such a vessel had been seized. The National Crime Agency, too, has commented on the larger seizures as a result of the lockdown in countries where drugs such as, source countries such as Colombia, and where aviation and shipping bans have caused organised crime groups to move larger quantities in each consignment, leading them to be more vulnerable to interception. The impact on county lines drug supply is particularly interesting because commentators appear to be split on whether the lockdown is a help or a hindrance. It is perhaps axiomatic that disrupted supply chains have impacted on the availability of heroin and crack cocaine, but there's no suggestion that the market has shrunk. The UK is the biggest market for cocaine within Europe, and that hasn't changed overnight, nor will scarcity of the product necessarily reduce the demand. In fact, it tends to increase prices as users are faced with the choice to pay more or use something else. More specifically, at the height of the lockdown, it was suggested that fewer workers in the county lines drugs distribution model were prepared to travel distances to markets for fear that they might be stopped by the police. But as the freedom of movement gradually returns, this becomes less relevant. It's also been suggested that in some cases, those that wanted or needed to were still able to leave their homes armed with the excuse that they were taking their daily exercise or going to work so that they could continue to access their markets. 2 days ago, a BBC report highlighted that one experienced inner city youth worker claimed the lockdown could help teenagers caught up in the gangs to reflect and turn on their lives and turn their back on the gangs and out-of-town dealers that are prevalent in county lines. Adding that, provided once the restrictions are lifted, that robust and sufficient safeguarding measures are in place in order to reduce that the risk of the vulnerable populations returning to that activity. However, a contrary view is voiced by Professor Simon Harding, Director of the National Centre for Gang Research at the University of West London, who said, in fact, the lockdown have made people more vulnerable. As street gangs are forced to find new tactics, such as grooming and recruitment online, they're using tactics that we've seen previously in child sexual exploitation, taking place in the virtual world, and that use has accelerated. And in both cases of child criminal exploitation and child sexual exploitation, the danger is that often families have no idea what's going on, meaning that one of the negative impacts of the pandemic could be more children and vulnerable persons criminally exploited. This at a time where the extra burden placed on the police and other agencies with whom they work to safeguard such populations are already working with stretched resources could be further challenged. So looking at the impact on illegal migratory flows, we saw that as the world effectively shut down, an initial dramatic impact on the ability of organised crime to move people across borders. For example, in Colombia and Honduras, prices were hiked as organised crime groups keen to exploit those desperate to flee the country increased their prices through what I call partially closed borders. And the reason why I say partially is because organised crime has always found a way to make borders porous long before the pandemic. So whilst it might have introduced some additional challenges, there is no evidence to suggest they became insurmountable. And closer to home, the already precarious future of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers crossing to Europe has become even more certain. A large number of migrants are stuck in transit and particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. In April in Greece, officials quarantined a refugee camp in Risona after 20 of its more than 2,000 residents tested positive. And the further quarantine has taken place recently and also in a camp in Malta. So the limitations on movement have made it more difficult for people fleeing wars and persecution, but also those looking generally for a better life. And it raises pressing questions about what special steps governments need to take to safeguard migrants from exploitation from organised crime groups. I now want to move on to how organised crime has infiltrated the private space through online fraud, cyber-related attacks. One common factor is that criminals are exploiting people's fear of the virus, and they're preying on the public's need for assurance and protection, and the faith that they have in trusted institutions, so that they too in turn can benefit opportunistically from the situation. So Action Fraud reported in mid-April about £2 million has been lost to coronavirus-related fraud in the UK. About 824 people, it said, had fallen victim to COVID-19 scams. One of the prominent categories of coronavirus-related scams has been the offer of non-existent or faulty products that Richard alluded to earlier. Online shopping scams include where people have ordered protective gear that hasn't arrived. And in one such investigation, criminals in West Africa have set up hundreds of these scam websites in the last month, targeting business, hospitals, care homes, and where they hope to buy in bulk. Another area is fake government branded websites. Analysis shows that 70,000 malicious websites have also sprung up since the global pandemic. Guidance issued by the National Cyber Security Centres detected more UK government branded scams related to COVID-19 than any other subject since the start of the pandemic. And there are now 2,500 that they're aware of, ranging from fake offers of tax rebates to bogus medicines. So these attempts to make individuals hand over personal or even bank details by clicking on a link are just scams that actually lead to a phishing exercise. One particular one as well, the coronavirus tracker app, in fact, just installed ransomware onto the phone aimed at stealing information as well. So it's also led to a healthy trade, if that's the right word, in the sharing of templates on the dark web of how to defraud people. Another area is emails from spoof organizations purporting to be the World Health Organization, for argument's sake, or individuals with the word doctors in their title. Amongst the issues that hospitals already are facing with are reported threats from hackers who are using fake emails. And once open, they give criminals access to personal files. And they hope to extort large sums of money in return for not leaking confidential information. In the US, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention says that many fake email sites ask for donation, but again, they're in fact just phishing exercises. So just to conclude that part, cybercrime in general has emerged rapidly as a risk area that could have long-term implications for law enforcement and for the growth of criminal markets. Similar, those with deviant tastes may use time to seek out sites offering live child sexual exploitation, where there's already a ready supply of children, as children are kept home from school, and both criminal groups and impoverished families look for new sources of income. The concern is how this exploitation may continue long after the effects of the pandemic have moved on. So in my concluding comments, I recognise it's not been able to cover the full gambit of organised crime here. Those organised criminals involved in other areas have talked about stockpiling of reserves of raw ivory and pangolin scales for those that are involved in the wildlife trade. For example, what is clear though is that criminal opportunism will emerge further as the crisis unfolds. And that means that those that work in or around law enforcement and criminal justice need nothing to despair, because there's little chance that organised crime groups would go bust because of the global lockdown, mainly because there's too much profit in it for them. Thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Jonathan.
Thank you, Keith. Let's go straight to the questions. We've got quite a number of them. I think the first one is directed at Richard, and it comes from David Argenstall, one of our associate fellows and an expert on management. He was saying that he accepts your point about how the policing went well, but it felt in the moment when the crisis started that the police were sort of bounced into ensuring compliance, and it didn't feel like a well-rehearsed response. So from your knowledge of police days, was there a discussion before or pre-planning about responding to such an emergency? And are you satisfied that the response was not ultimately improvised? Richard?
Thank you, Jonathan. As David will know, that there has been an operating framework for dealing with an influenza pandemic since 2017, and indeed the police service, alongside other emergency services, has practiced and tested and exercised the response to a pandemic. However, I don't think anyone had anticipated the kind of measures that were put in place in this crisis. The crazily restrictive measures of lockdown in terms of our experience in freedom. No one really had anticipated that, I don't think, and despite the fact that we'd seen it and witnessed it in China, no one really thought that those measures were necessary here. Clearly they were necessary, and obviously we've seen the epidemic impact come down as a result of those measures. But so it wasn't so much a surprise, but I think that it required some tremendous working through between the agencies and government to put these measures in place. And obviously that required a statutory instrument in law to bring that in. But I think the important point is that the way that the police have implemented and, if you like, enforced that law, I think has been world class. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that. Excellent. The next question I think I'll pass on to Keith, and it's from Mike Maiden, a defense expert here in London, and it's asking whether we have any data on the rate of cybercrime increase. I mean, one hears anecdotal points. You, Keith, mentioned yourself, but do we have any sort of serious data about how significant the problem of cybercrime really is?
Good question. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the question. But yeah, so I mentioned earlier about some of the financial losses that are directly attributable to the pandemic. I think the important thing to remember when we talk about cybercrime is a lot of it is hidden and therefore very difficult to estimate. And cyber-related fraud in particular, if we accept the suggestion that only about a third of all fraud is reported, then the figures and the numbers actually that are given actually have very little meaning because they're woefully inaccurate. I think inaccurate. The other thing to say as well is that because of the clandestine nature of organised crime, and also how police forces, law enforcement fairly jealously guard their data, it's often very difficult to ascertain the true level of any kind of criminal activity. And with the dark web in particular, then that adds yet another element where estimating the size of cybercrime becomes increasingly difficult. What is apparent throughout the whole of this pandemic, and obviously relating the answer back to that, is that whilst people are working from home, the only way for criminals really, or one of the main ways for criminals to reach their target audience is now through cyberspace. And consequently, that is why we've seen such a rapid increase in that activity. Thank you for your question. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. The next question is from Paul Peachy from the National newspaper, a newspaper in the Gulf, who's asking about suggestions that the pace of radicalization from recruitment on to actually considering committing a terrorist attack has quickened as a result of the current sort of pandemic, or perhaps as a result of the current pandemic. That is very much your bread and butter, Richard. What do you think?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about this, and there's been quite a lot of reporting nationally about suggesting that some of our extremists who are confined to their homes will be using the internet more and will be becoming more seriously radicalized. I don't think there's any evidence for that personally. And academic evidence suggests that people are more readily radicalized and more speedily radicalized through face-to-face contact, obviously, which has been massively reduced because of the lockdown. So my sense is that actually there's been less radicalization, most probably, because some of those who are inclined to be getting involved and drawn into extremism won't be able to meet others who are already extremist. And the history of radicalization in the UK over the last 20 years is very much one of local British-born individuals becoming radicalized, but through contact with extremist groups such as Al-Majroon and the like, and not necessarily just through internet radicalization. So I haven't seen any evidence of any speeding up because people got more access to internet, and suggest that it's probably not actually happening. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for that. Let me turn now to a question which I think is for both panelists, from Lizzie Dearden, the Home Affairs correspondent of the Independent newspaper here in London, who's asking about the day after, as it were. The levels of poverty that are likely to increase as a result of the economic downturn, which everyone now expects will follow this pandemic. Wouldn't that, you would think, lead to an expectation of a rise in what she calls the acquisitive crime, namely the thefts and everything else? So we may be here in a little trough at the moment because of circumstances, or only to be followed by quite a big rise thereafter. Richard, you'd like to start, and perhaps Keith will have something to bring in on this as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. As Lizzie will probably know, that the criminologists will probably take issue with you suggesting potentially that crime could increase because people have less money in their pockets. I think we're going to see, obviously we're in the midst of a recession already, and we're going to see some hardship. But it will be interesting to see whether acquisitive crime returns to even the levels that we saw before this crisis. And as I said earlier on, I'd like to see, and I'm hopeful that the police will be able to suppress the crime levels because they've had this opportunity, this pause, if you like, and this opportunity to get to gain momentum, to bear down on criminals. They've been making a lot of arrests of known offenders because they've known where they are. A lot of warrants have been executed. So I'm optimistic that crime can actually be suppressed and be held down. And I don't think particularly it's going to rise based on recessionary pressures. Over to you, John.
Keith?
Yes, thank you. The only thing I'll add to that as well, and perhaps on a more sort of global perspective, but it has been argued in certain developing countries as well that the government and law enforcement in particular, through COVID-19, have had the opportunity to assert their authority, perhaps for the first time, in certain marginalised spaces where previously they lacked that ability. Now, it's far too early to say whether that's going to have any long-term effect, but if you sort of translate that into the UK as well, what Richard was saying was the efforts of the UK police in terms of not only arresting people, but establishing those sort of good community ties as well, may well help to rebuff or to dampen down any potential spike in increased crime in the future. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for that. I think we've got a batch of questions about coordination across government agencies. One from Friga Inkirigwag, asking whether there was any discussion about military help to the police authorities during this pandemic, whether we ever reached that particular moment or there was a feeling that we could reach it. And a similar, slightly different, but similar question from Pippa Goodman, who's asking about what kind of lessons can be drawn from our handling at the moment in terms of coordinating with other government agencies and a whole government approach should a similar crisis strike us in the future. Richard, would you like to start on that?
So thank you for those two questions. Yes, I think the setup, if you like, the committee setup in COBRA and the subcommittees that fall out of that have stood up very well to this crisis. The UK has had the Civil Contingencies Act since 2004. There's obviously the National Security Council presides over the range of security threats and risks, of which one, of course, is this risk of coronavirus. And I think that the emergency response from the UK government has stood up very well to this crisis. There's been daily COBRA meetings, subcommittees as well. And obviously, around the COBRA table will be the military as well as all the relevant government departments. The military have obviously had a major role in this crisis, not so much in supporting the police service, but very much supporting the Department of Health in the creation of the hospitals in fast time, and obviously the logistical challenges around PPE. So the military have already had a major role, police a role too, but the coordination has been good and it has stood up to this. So of course there'll be learning, there'll be substantial learning from this crisis, as there is from any crisis. But I think that the infrastructure was there to deal with this. The UK has got very good resilience measures. It has local resilience forums already set up around the country, and these have been in place for many years. And a lot of the times we've learned from previous terrorist attacks. Obviously, this has been an enduring crisis that has gone on for months now, so it's required a slightly different approach. But the infrastructure, if you like, in government, the crisis management structure in government, the National Security Council, the Civil Contingency Secretariat, etc., has stood up very well. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Richard. Keith?
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add as well, and this will not surprise you, I work for a research institution. So research in relation to the whole pandemic and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and what lessons we might learn for the future is most definitely, there's a call for that, and RUSI would be keen to exploit that opportunity. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Keith. Let's turn again in the subject of the machinery of government to a question from Yubing Kang of China's Central Television about the appointment of Mr. Tom Hurd as a counterterrorism expert, as head of the new sort of UK biosecurity centre. Richard, what does it tell us? It's quite an interesting departure. Does it tell us that there are particular skills of counterterrorism that are translatable to these kind of emergencies? And how do you envisage this centre to work and add to our resilience?
So thank you, Jonathan. I mean, I think this is a very good appointment. I think it's a very important step that the government sets up this biosecurity centre. I actually called for it in a paper on contact tracing that I wrote about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The reason why someone like Tom Hurd, who's from the Office for Security and Counterterrorism within the Home Office, why someone like Tom is suitable for this role is because he will be able to galvanize the analysts within the various agencies across government to work in analyzing the proliferation, if you like, of this epidemic, to identify hotspots, outbreaks, etc. And then obviously to link in with the contact, test and trace strategy to ensure that episodic outbreaks are extinguished, as it were. Now, the expertise of strategic analysis and also indeed tactical analysis within government sits within the intelligence agencies and within the police, and very much is part of the national counterterrorism infrastructure that's been well honed over the years. So I think it's a very sensible step to appoint somebody of that background to this role, and I think it's going to be a very, very important organization as we go forward. I mean, as long ago as 2004, Taiwan has had a similar command center. They set that up on the back of the SARS outbreak in 2003. So the reason why we need this is not just in the short term, but it's in the long term, because obviously the risk of a pandemic, a new pandemic, is still prevalent. So even when we defeat, if you like, the coronavirus threat from our communities, there could be potential further pandemics down the road. So we're going to need to treat this risk more seriously. We now understand the magnitude of this risk, and we need to allocate resources to it. And we're going to have a national coordination function, which is what this Biosecurity Centre is. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for that, Richard. I think I'll stick to you for a moment. I will pass then to Keith, but you have two direct questions in a way. One from Mohammed Tousif, who runs the Westminster Centre for Research and Strategy, who's asking whether we're not too rosy-eyed about how we handle this particular point, namely that the lockdown has made it very difficult to conduct interviews with both victims of crime and with witnesses, and therefore the collection of information may have been hampered by the health crisis. Coupled with that, there's a question from John Simpson, the crime correspondent of the Times, who is asking whether you envisage that once the freedom of movement is restored, there could be pent-up sort of difficulties for the security services and the police. Up to now, we had far fewer referrals through the Prevent and channel, and therefore, we will make up for lost time, as it were, when life returns to normality. Richard?
Well, thank you, John and Mohammed, for those questions. So taking Mohammed's question first, are we too rosy-eyed about the ability of police to take statements and witness statements, etc., and to get on with their normal day job? Clearly, they have been hampered in terms of those activities, but they've also been blessed, if you like, with significant reductions in demand. There's been no nighttime economy to deal with, no pubs kicking out, large mass gatherings, football gatherings, etc. So policing has had a bit of a rest in certain areas and has been able to focus in on identifying known offenders, dealing with warrants, and indeed the crimes that they have been able to deal with. They've had the resource to deal with. The sickness levels weren't as high as had been forecast, as I said earlier. So they've been able to get on with it. I know that some senior investigating officers from the major incident teams have been able to spend time, because of the reduction in murder, have spent time dealing with casework to clear up their existing casework from existing cases. So if you like, dealing with the backlog in anticipation of what's to come. Now, to take John's question, are we going to return to normal levels once the lockdown restrictions are released? Well, John, as I said earlier on, I really hope not. I hope that this opportunity will be seized on by the police, that they'll be able to regain the momentum, put pressure where it needs to be on the criminal. They'll have the capacity and the capability to do that. And they'll need to be forward-leaning on that. So that will mean reclaiming those hotspot areas that have previously been the preserve of violent criminals, of gangs, etc. Getting visibility out to those hotspots, patrolling those hotspots, preventing, if you like, crime from coming back, and also going on the front foot with the individuals themselves, with the gang nominals, getting into them, giving them opportunity to be diverted from their criminality. So I'm an optimist, John. I hope that that the British police succeed in that, and I hope that the crime levels do not return to the levels they were at, because they were certainly in places, particularly violent crime, extremely high by historical standards. So I'm optimistic that they'll be kept down to reasonable levels, and certainly not going back to where they were. Thank you, Jonathan.
Keith, two questions to you. You referred to scams online, a variety of scams that have taken place during this period of lockdown. There's a question from Madeleine Moon, a distinguished MP, and also from Patrick Curry about the sheer, do we have any idea about the sheer quantity of the rise in these crimes? And has there been a collaboration between a variety of agencies, like fraud agencies, those agencies dedicated to financial fraud, especially since there's been a lot of micropayments by the Chancellor's Department on relief payments with the current crisis, and therefore almost unending supply of potential online scams and frauds. Keith?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you both for your question. So again, really in terms of the size, well, again, it's still very difficult, as I mentioned earlier, to estimate the size, and some of the evidence tends to point to a lot of the growth in the online scams have taken place by criminals operating outside of the UK, but obviously their back garden, if you like, for want of a better expression, has been many countries, including the UK. But as we move forward and as restrictions are lifted, then those particular opportunities to make capital of people's fear and people's need for information and certain feeling of uncertainty becomes diminished. That's not to say that the criminals won't find other ways to exploit scams or to revert back to some of those activities that they previously operated. In terms of the question around collaboration, well, yes, most definitely. And there's been a lot of, I didn't cover it in my presentation because of the sheer length of time that I was talking, but there's a hell of a lot of advice online about, which I'm happy to share, with advice as to where you can go if you think you've been scammed, what you can do to prevent yourself from being scammed. There is that old adage about if something looks too good to be true, then it most likely is. And a number of organisations, agencies, both from the public and private sector, have worked very closely together to try and get this information out and to really publicise. And you've probably seen adverts on the television from banks, etc., highlighting the increased risk and imploring people to be just that extra little bit vigilant and to reinforce messages that, in the case of banks, that they don't ask for personal details. So if you're being asked to provide such detail, then you're probably being scammed, or someone's trying to scam you in a certain way. So there has been a lot of collaboration. There's always room for more collaboration, but I think one of the strengths that's come out of this crisis, and as Richard said earlier, there are always opportunities and learning points and strengths, has been that degree of cooperation and collaboration between both the public and private sector. Back to you, Jonathan.
Richard, we have a supplementary from John Simpsons from the Times, who I think would want you to expand a bit more about the potential for a recurring terrorist threat immediately after the movement of people is restored fully. Do you envisage that, or is the trend unrelated, as it were, to the lockdown period? I think the real question is, do we have some pent-up threats there that have just been stored, as it were, for the moment, but will come and bite us the moment we do lift all the restrictions?
It's very difficult to know, John, whether that is the case. What's happened over the last 2 months is obviously a diminishing amount of intelligence, both from overseas intelligence and police agencies, but also domestically here, because it's been almost impossible for the police to do their normal activities of monitoring extremism. And of course, the extremists and terrorists have been confined to homes. So whether that equates to pent-up desire to carry out extremist and terrorist acts when the lockdown ceases is an interesting question, but I don't know the answer to it. Obviously, you'd have to ask the intelligence agencies really on that one. But I am aware that there's been, if you like, a quietening of activity in terms of chatter between extremists and terrorists, because they've been, frankly, preoccupied with survival like the rest of us. So the circumstances have not provided opportunities for them. And I go back to my previous point, which is that indigenous extremism, those British-born nationals here, those who have engaged in terrorist and extremist acts in recent years, have tended to encourage and cajole each other through contact between each other, face to face, setting up in groups, personal contact, and that opportunity has not happened. So I don't think we know whether there's pent up intention to carry out terrorist attacks when this is over. I hope that if you like, the nature of terrorism may have changed on the back of this. Perhaps, certainly, our perception of terrorism will have changed. I think the fear of terrorism globally may also have changed. We've now seen a threat or a risk that is far more damaging, if you like, and far more lethal. And all of us are questioning that. So I think that, if you like, the sting may have come out of the tail of the narrative of some terrorist groups, whether they be Islamist, the far right, or environmental groups, as we all grapple with what looks like a far more severe and deadly risk, and as we look forward to confronting that deadly risk. So our perception of terrorism is certainly changing, and let's hope that that's the case for those who have extremist or terrorist inclinations too, that they might reflect on what they've faced over the last 2 months and think that it's actually worth doing something slightly different, like living a normal life. Over to you, Jonathan.
Excellent. We're approaching the end, so I will ask both of you to be fairly brief. There's a very big question from Dr. Anna Sergi, a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Essex, who is saying that actually the international discourse, the dialogue internationally about the post-COVID era, is that there will be an increased border corruption. There will be a twisting of the legal economy through a variety of loan sharking and crime activities. And there would be an increased forms of infiltration and national relief protocols through the exploitation of community infrastructures, all part and parcel of the aftermath of the epidemic. So are we paying enough attention to this in the UK, or is our discussion about crime and policing fairly parochial still compared to the kind of dialogue that is going on in the world about the future threats that we may face as a result of the pandemic? Keith, would you like to start first?
Yes, and thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the question as well. So no, I don't think we are failing to recognise the potential outcomes at all. So the National Crime Agency in particular writes the National Strategic Assessment. Has recently published that. It also periodically updates that information through the issue of intelligence assessments. There's an infrastructure in the UK that works between law enforcement at the top level and the security and intelligence services. The horizon scanning of what the problems may follow will be in train at the moment, and measures put in place to try and reduce some of their pernicious effects. In terms of one of the particular things you mentioned, increased border corruption, well, we see a fair degree of border corruption in the first place anyway. So there is a pressing need, and this was before the pandemic, to tackle some of the drivers and enablers of organised crime, and corruption is one of them, and criminal finance, which, as I said in my presentation, for the most part is the main motivation for committing organised crime. To tackle those issues on a much broader base rather than necessarily some of the siloed approaches to looking at individual threats. So I would say that the relevant organisations and agencies are aware of it, they're working on it, and they will introduce measures to try and reduce those effects, not only nationally, but working with their international partners as well to ensure a more coherent and holistic response. Thank you, Jonathan.
Richard?
Thank you. I would just say all forms of fraud are likely to continue to increase, particularly online fraud, procurement fraud, and public sector fraud. We've seen quite a lot of fraud linked to, obviously, government initiatives, the unintended consequences, if you like, of the relaxation of means of applying for benefits of one kind or another. So, and all of those things you mentioned, yes, there could well be a shift globally on those, but I think that most of those crimes you mentioned are the remit of the National Crime Agency, which is now working quite hard to combat. So the UK does have an infrastructure. Whether the resourcing of the National Crime Agency is adequate at the current time for this explosion of online fraud is an interesting question. I would personally say that it should be better funded and needs to be more substantially funded to cope with some of these new online crimes as we go into a post-COVID era. Thank you, Jonathan.
And literally 30 seconds from each one of you, because we are now past our time. I think a sort of uplifting question from Tom McTague from The Atlantic magazine, who's saying whether there's any evidence that the current crisis has increased the social solidarity and cohesion of the nation, and therefore that in itself could have an impact on crime in the future. Let's end on an uplifting tone. Richard?
Well, that's a really good question. I really hope so. I've seen certainly plenty of evidence of it in my local community. Social cohesion in the UK, I think, has been massively strengthened as a result of this across the board. Better integration, people and communities working together. It's been, it's been a thing to behold. So I agree, and I hope we see a continuation of that into the future. So thank you for the question.
Keith?
Yeah, most definitely. And to echo something that Richard mentioned earlier about the role of the police. So the role of the police in policing the pandemic has been a very softly approach, and I think they have garnered widespread support in the main for how they've conducted their business, and adding that to also the community spirit that has been mentioned by Richard as well. I think those two combinations are actually show some positive roots and some positive signs for the future, and I hope that we are able to exploit that for the good. Thank you.
Thank you to both panelists for an excellent presentation. Apologies to those from our audience who were not able to put their questions. I can assure you I've tried as hard as possible, but there are limitations. We will return to this, no doubt, in the near future. Meanwhile, all that remains for me is to thank the panelists, thank the audience, and to invite you to join us again next Thursday at exactly the same time as we try to map the security implications of the current pandemic. It's goodbye from the Institute in London.